Thank you for joining me on the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about activism in psychology and, in my opinion, how it's coming close to ruining psychology's reputation in the general population. I'm going to go ahead and give a preface here. I write scripts for all of my episodes, and I try to follow them point by point. This might be one of those episodes where I might deviate a little bit, and it's fine. I hope at least, and I hope you as a listener is ready to join along with me. So let's talk about the field of psychology, give a brief overview so we can talk about how things have changed. Originally, psychology was focused on things. It was focused on dynamics and symptomology. This was incredibly useful to understand more underlying biological issues and connected to the human psyche. However, over time, that focus on things, on symptomology, slowly started to shift towards an interest in relationships and emotions. This was ultimately a great thing. If we were able to hold both symptoms, personal expectations and responsibilities, with family and couple dynamics, we've created a system where we can acknowledge both what one person has to deal with as well as how it plays into the greater connections around them. Then something interesting happened. Partially out of this need to study relationships came this overall consideration of what is a healthy interaction with the world. No longer was psychology focused just on the individual or just on the couple and family unit, but in the greater world at large. We started to have greater discussions in the psychology field about how political organizations, how governments and cultures have started to influence people's thoughts, patterns, and behaviors, and ultimately try to push responsibility onto these things. It was at that time when psychology started focusing on these greater ideas, these greater political or social powers, that the field moved from relationships and symptomology into activism. Because if you believed as a psychologist or as a therapist that there were greater things affecting a client, and you wanted that client to heal, it would make natural sense that you should go and engage in changing things. Some of the things that I'm going to be talking about today, I've heard personally from colleagues, but it's mostly going to be focused on the experiences that I have had in grad school and in further trainings outside of it. So, like every good episode here, let's define our terms. Let me tell you what I mean by activism. Activism is following and supporting a cause. Activism nowadays is a little more complicated than it has been in the past. Activism beforehand has been things like marching and giving speeches, donating, or in some wonderful and amazing instances, smuggling people out of slavery, pulling them across the country. I would consider those people some of the most amazing activists in U.S. history. But activism has changed since then. There's moved from less and less skin in the game. No longer do you have to put yourself on the line for activism. You can just shout from the corners. Sometimes this shouting and advocacy can be great. There are issues that still need to come to light. There are concerns, legitimate ones, that people still have. Some of these include rights, especially around the world, that people, particularly women and children, are missing out on. You can also have great activism around accessibility, the openness for everyone to gain the same potential as everyone else. Now, that can't always be ingrained. Everyone should always be this smart, or we change all the standards. That's not what I mean. But this ability to access resources, or this potential connection, all of this can be a wonderful thing. However, There are some grave issues with activism nowadays. The first one I talked about earlier. When you are trying to support a cause, in today's world, it's much different in the past. In today's world, you can go on social media, you can talk to friends, and you can grandstand about just how awesome a movement is, how much it's very needed. But you don't actually have to do much of anything. Granted, there are people who do marches, there are people who give to causes, but for the most part, today's activism is just telling people how awesome and moral you are. The other big point in all of this, something that I think has plagued a ton of advocacy and activism groups, is a struggle with an endpoint. Once you reach your goal in activism, then what? A great example of this could be something like the 19th Amendment and the right to vote for women. There's hardly anyone that would be upset about that. But once they reach their goals, then what? Then what happens? Sure, there are other rights and laws that need to be adjusted, 100%. But then what? What happens when all legal standards are equal? When there is nothing within a judicial framework that prioritizes men over women, then what happens? This is one of the interesting outgrowths of activism. Without a clearly defined end goal, activism just continues. And I don't think this is necessarily new to the modern world, but I think it's highly emphasized here. Without a clearly defined endpoint, activism can move from achieving objectives into people becoming more invested in the act of activism than of actual change. Let me say that one more time. Modern activism suffers from people becoming more invested in the act of activism than actual change. From that, you can find a ton of people who can create a sense of meaningless importance. People can become advocates and they can support activism, but accomplish pretty much nothing. They could feel important, like they belong to something. And actually, they don't accomplish much of anything at all. And unfortunately, people can end up moving against their own interests or the things that they say that they hold dear. Activism nowadays has moved from a perceived cultural shift into an identity of itself. There's an entire group of the Western world that sees themselves as activists. What are they activists for? Whatever the current thing is. I hope now you're starting to get a sense of where I think psychology has gone wrong. And even if you haven't listened to this podcast before, you can definitely recall some of the ways that that sense of activism has infiltrated psychology. So let me define my other term here. What do I mean by psychology? Psychology encompasses research, therapy, and theory. This is when we put the data together, how we intervene with clients and patients, and our theory, how we understand the world. What has happened over the years, and maybe I can go into this deeper in another episode, but over the years, activism has moved from a section of psychology. For instance, if we notice that people with intellectual disabilities have cognitive capacity worthy of equal consideration, that's something that psychologists should put forth. The problem is that sense of activism that I was talking about before, where people are more invested in the act of activism than actual change. We've moved from a sense of wonder in science into supporting whatever the current thing is. Psychology itself has moved from creating literature to supporting pre-existing ideas, the proverbial cart before a horse. The psychology field has become less concerned about finding theories for evidence. Instead, It's unfortunate now as I look through the data in my own PhD program, we're looking for evidence to fit our predetermined theories. I'll give you some examples of this, both personally and in some things that I've seen. There was this interaction that I had in grad school, and this might seem foreign or wild to someone who has never been a part of something like this, but I completed something called a privilege walk. What a privilege walk is when a whole bunch of people stand on one side of the room, and then because of the quote-unquote privileges they've experienced, they will take a step forward. If you had two parents in a home, if you weren't scared of where you live, things like that. At the very end of the privilege walk, you were supposed to look around and see your classmates or other participants and acknowledge how much better you had it, all of the privileges that you had. And it's supposed to invoke this sense of indignation or concern. What actually happened is people felt empowered or shamed because of where they've been. What does this have to do with psychology and science? Something like a privilege walk could be interesting. Sure, it's a topic. Why not? Let's explore important things of the day. The issue is when that became an activist cause rather than something to be curious about. Because, we didn't have a privilege walk on mental health. The things that we are here to help with in psychology. We didn't take a walk to see who had the most privileges or rights associated with mental health. We didn't take a walk and ask, how many of you have had hallucinations before? How many of you have ever wondered if suicide was the right answer? No. Because psychology has moved away from asking genuine questions in whole and has moved towards activist ideas. I saw this in another experience in grad school. I went to a conference, something that most people have to go to if you want to be a licensed therapist. And this conference was rather interesting because I attended one of the seminars around privilege. I wanted to give everything a fair shake before I got upset. And I listened to this presenter provide a case, didn't agree with it, but she was rather passionate, and I can respect the fact that she was well-spoken and passionate. And I came up to ask a question afterwards. And I said, okay, all of the stuff that you're talking about makes sense. How do you reconcile it with this data? And instead of getting an answer, someone completely unrelated to the presenter berated me for being mean, being a jerk. The presenter themselves said nothing. I stepped back until I said, well, it sounds like it's my time to go. I've had a lot of experiences like that, and a lot of my colleagues have as well, where questions aren't to be asked. There are the current things that psychology fields represent, and you have to go along with them. In a more charitable explanation, it's because you want to support people who are hurting. In a more cynical point of view, a lot of therapy organizations or leaders are looking for SEALs to clap for them because they want to feel important. And this is where a lot of the issue comes in. What happens when activism outranks our understanding of human beings? I'll give you another example of something that I've seen. Even outside of a standardized area where there's clinical oversight, I've tried to have conversations, and it's become very apparent that there are two groups of psychology mainly. Those that believe the quote-unquote current thing and wholly support it, and those that don't, but fear for speaking out because those in power will enact retribution on them. This might seem a little sad or overwhelming if you're someone looking for a therapist or is hoping to find some sort of benefit out of therapy, but I will tell you from my own experience that there are large groups of people who would happily shut down someone like me simply because I like to ask questions and challenge people, and I'm never on board with just supporting the quote-unquote current thing. There are therapists like us out there. Sometimes you have to look for keywords. You have to ask us questions about what we believe in a comfortable setting. There are always crazies. I'll go ahead and point that out there. Sometimes there are activists on both sides of things that, I don't know, you kind of see them as the weird younger brother and try to ignore them as much as you can. What does this have to do with overall psychology? I don't know if psychology has ever been in this perfect place. I don't want to assume that there's some magical time we have to go back to. This isn't that at all. I do think we need to stay away from becoming the ultimate expert on everything that has to do with the human mind and the suffering of the soul. Although we give up a lot of ground by saying, well, we have all of these years of data, but you seem really passionate, so we should listen to you. That issue that I just mentioned, it's giving up the right to say something. You might be listening to this episode and saying, that's what's happening right now, and you'd be wrong. Because, see, that actually happened a while ago. And that cohort trained the current one. The past cohort of therapists and psychologists, the people before myself, were the ones that were told to stop asking questions. And they, therefore, trained a whole generation of therapists. Not that you should hold your beliefs secret, but those beliefs don't have any value, therefore you shouldn't ask. So now the psychology field is in an issue. We're at an impasse where a lot of people don't trust therapists and psychologists, and unfortunately, rightly so. Some of these people are crazy. I'm a part of some Facebook therapist groups, and some of the things that are posted on there are frankly terrifying. Not that they're directly hurting anyone, but they're supporting ideologies and theories that have no empirical value at all. It just feels nice to say. And what is someone like me supposed to do? Well, I have colleagues who have said something, and I'll tell you exactly what happens. They get kicked from the groups for being intolerant, for asking too many questions. And so now we're in a second generation of activism in psychology, where most of the people around my age who graduated around the same time that I have don't know that there was ever anything different. We assume that this is how psychology has always been, and it hasn't. Psychology has become overrun by political ideology. I don't just mean political as in Republican, Democrat, right, left. It's not what I mean. I mean that there's been this weird connection between psychology and the human thought and people's overall theories of community, government, ideology. If you ever take the time to read things like Marxism, this stuff's everywhere here. It makes me nauseous. Not because the stuff itself can't be argued, it's not that at all, but there are generations of authors that we're taught in the psychology field that view everything as oppressor and oppressed. The problem is that has no empirical value. Marxism, when it's ever been tried, trashes everything. But because activism has seemed to come first, it doesn't matter how people think. It doesn't matter what they're going through or what their personal experience is. When you start with activism before psychology, the human mind is corrupted and told that it is okay. And that's probably the biggest issue I have with all of this, is that because of activism, it's no longer a nuisance. It's hurting people, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, and then gaslighting them into believing that they're the problem. What did you think was going to happen when all of a sudden you tell a whole bunch of children that they're wrong and they're the oppressor? What did you think was going to happen to their sense of anxiety and depression and way in the world? Any psychologist worth their salt 10, 15, 20, maybe even 30 years ago at this point would have told you that's a terrible idea. Why would you tell a whole bunch of children that they're inherently bad? Well, if you want to be a great, well-standing psychologist today, you might have to bend the knee, or you might be tempted to. So what do we do from all of this? One, I can't necessarily advocate for a schism or a breakaway from major therapeutic organizations, because they have the standing for what we can practice with. If I decide to throw away my marriage and family therapy license, do you know what happens? In some cases, for some clients, not a lot, but for the ones that are relying on insurance reimbursement or anything of that sort, they can't see me anymore. I can no longer step in and help organizations or work for organizations that try to help people. So I can't advocate that we just toss everything and run away and make our own stuff. But I do think we need more people to stand up and say, this is garbage. Why on earth are we promoting activism over what promotes healing? This is just nonsense. But what we also need to do is go back to our roots of exploring the human psyche, engaging in philosophy to better understand the world around us. I think people do engage in philosophy. It's just short-sighted and underdeveloped. People just copy and paste from what they've heard. But if we were to truly consider what it is that we believe and how the human mind is put together, I think we could have greater conversations on how to help people. This philosophical debate, I think, is being lost en masse. I don't think it's just the psychology field that's losing this, but I think around something like psychology, where it's not the hard science, this isn't chemistry, it isn't mathematics, we have to engage in philosophy because we're working with complex people, the suffering of the soul, and if we only focus on activism or numbers, we miss the person. The last thing I'll say in relation to what we do about it, we have to work from data and experience instead of political movements. The thing is about political movements is this is no longer activism for specific rights or freedoms. It's become religious. And so the field that claims to be the scientific rigor of the human mind has become a religious organization where you have to bend the knee and read the right people and recite the correct creeds in order to play ball. We need to move to a time when there's open discussion, where we can debate with one another, bring theories and data instead of just wondering who the oppressor is in the room so we can kick them out. Activism in psychology is beginning to poison the well so terribly, I wonder how much longer people are going to trust even those like me, those who want to ask good questions, are starting to become so enveloped in this activist psychology that I wonder how many people are going to listen to psychologists at all. Part of me is fearful that there's a time when this entire field is just discredited by the sniff test. Nobody wants to listen to a psychologist. All they talk about is random activism that doesn't do anything. I hope that we do move towards data and critical thinking. I hope that we do move to a time where all of a sudden we can have open discussion. We can call out nonsense and not feel like our license will be revoked or we'll be entirely shamed, but also that we don't have to make our own little subgroups. It doesn't mean much of anything. For anybody listening who's wondering where all of this goes, look, there might not be a ton that you can specifically do, but if you want to find good therapists, if you want to find people who actually want to help you, they shouldn't be overt activists. They should want to challenge you no matter who you are or where you're from or whatever your background is or what you're hoping to do. Your therapist should not be a mirror that just tells you how amazing you are. I hope that with this info, no matter who you are or where you come from, that you start to consider what things could look like differently or how in some cases you should stop listening to some psychologists or therapists. Thank you for listening today. I hope you found something useful out of all of this. This was a little bit of a passion episode for me. If you found some of this useful, I hope that you follow the podcast, share this with those that you think might benefit from it. If you feel the need, you can leave something as a tip for the production of this podcast so I can keep putting these episodes out. Thank you so much. Have a great day.